We're working on connecting the dots, looking at halachic policy. And what I said is policy is really is a view of the overall vision of Torah. It delineates the overall vision of Torah, and what it is connects the dots between of the purely halachic details. It connects the dots into some overall vision of what you think the Torah Jew should be. And I don't know if I've been clear about what the actual practical effect of policy determination is. So I just wrote down three. One is the determination of Lifnim B'Shuras Hadin, of going beyond the detail of the law, in terms of understanding what you're supposed to. There's details law, and then the idea of an overall approach you have to mankind. Even if let's say in the detail of halacha, you can find a Hecht or something like that. This is sort of a division on this is what a Torah Jew should do. So you have an overall vision. The second one is the approach to the law. The fact is that halacha can be somewhat dynamic, and you can be more makel, it can be more machmer, and even though in the actual halachic analysis what you're trying to do is just find the objective truth, the point is that you can be motivated in a certain direction as you're searching for the truth. Classic example is the Aguna. The Aguna specifically states in the Gemara that you try to be mata the Aguna. There's a value in being mata the Aguna. Now that doesn't mean you play with the law. It doesn't mean you don't do what you think is correct. But what it means is you're motivated to search the law to find a heter. Okay, and you want to analyze and investigate. So that's one role of policy. The third role of policy is choosing between various different viewpoints in halacha. There's always, in many cases, a spectrum of opinion, and then you choose which one you want to apply, or how you apply it. And even in terms of the definition of, say, a tzarech gadol, you say a great need, you want to apply this type of, you want to make this type of decision, what really is a tzarech gadol. And this has a tremendous amount of effects in terms of looking at policy visions, in terms of coming up with different conclusions. And they can be halachic, they can affect certain halacha, they can be in general. An interesting one is coming up with Pesach and the increase in the amount of Pesach resorts that exist in the world now, right? It's like you look in the newspaper, it's like almost every 5-star hotel in the world's got a Pesach program now, right? So there's an interesting issue. Is it good or is it bad? So certain people who say people aren't having Pesach in the home anymore. They should hit Pesach at home, they should be thinking. Other people are saying because they have these resorts, Pesach doesn't have to be this tedious, a tremendous amount of work for the people who make Pesach. Most times try to be sexually proper. Not to say this for the women, but for the people who make Pesach, right? But the fact is that some people say it's even a bigger inyan to go away for Pesach, because this way they take the vacation time around Yom Tov and they take off Chol Hamoed, and therefore they don't work in Yom Tov as well. So then comes up the halachic question: well, should you take your holiday around Chol Hamoed, right? Not to work. These are all examples of how policy will affect Jewish life. Okay, so what we're looking at last week, as we get further, what we're trying to look at is the fact that when you figure out policy, you're trying to work out the aspect of analyzing the sources. But what we came to realize is that there's a dynamic relationship between the one who's reading the sources and the sources themselves. There's a vast array of literature that encompasses the Torah literature. The fact is there's so much fluidity and flexibility within the system that how someone puts together the pieces to create a whole, the person himself or herself becomes a factor in that analysis because of the dynamic nature of the relationship. So what happens is, it's not just simply that the attitude of the individual reads into the material, but the material in fact reads back to the individual. So what happens is that there is actually a give and take. It's not so much that you put together the material that comes out with one idea and it sort of tells you what the answer is. It's the fact that the person putting together or connecting the dots, his being is a factor in how that person connects the dots and creates the overall vision from the various different details. And therefore the information is a role, but the role is also by the person who's reading the information. So that's how it becomes dynamic, and that's how it becomes difficult. Because it's not so black and white, here's what the Torah is saying. The Torah itself is open to various understandings, and the being of the individual in turn has been affected by what that person has learned already, reads back into the material within a certain vision. So it's much more dynamic, and what happens is part of the role of the individual in this process. Part of it is just the being of the person, inherent personality, the what you would call the genetic makeup of the person, the nature, and the other thing is his own starting education. Okay, if a person grew up within a certain educational system, that educational system will always affect how that person will continue to, or not always, like generally, will affect the way the person continues to read the material. So it's a dynamic relationship and so forth. That's why it's so difficult for individuals, because the person involved in determining this process, which then that person then declares this is the overall vision of Torah, that person himself or herself has already been involved from their own being in terms of that analysis. And that's where it starts getting difficult in this whole process, because what is the correct role of the individual in that process? Is there a limit on what the individual can do? Or is the individual just using Torah to read into it what he wants to do? And that's a tension that exists in our world today. The vast corpus of Jewish material exists in such a way that you could almost argue for almost any position, any value, applying Torah concepts, right? The fact is you can argue anything, especially if you go outside of the realm of halacha and go into conservative reform. You'll find that reform or so forth outside of love quoting sources to back up their viewpoint. And there's enough sources out there that they can develop an idea that this is a Torah value. Okay? What they'll do is maybe ignore other clear-cut statements that are that way, but you can find in the corpus of Torah literature a tremendous amount of different viewpoints that would support a person's viewpoint. Now, when you get more into halacha, you have to maintain a certain level of consistency, but there's enough material that it's open to you reading into the material what you want to read, rather than letting the material dictate to you. In the vision of a lot of people, they like when the Torah is black and white, and the Torah tells them exactly what is right and wrong, even though they may have difficulties with it. At least it's clear cut. That's what it says. It's black and white, and it's talking to me. But
if one has a wide range of interpretation,
right,
they can put on something,
right,
anywhere is maybe from a plain shot,
right,
to things that
right,
can be more and more esoterical. How does one presumably know? Again, is it
right?
It doesn't seem it should be my thoughts.
Right.
What I like is necessarily
right.
The best way, the proper way, etc.
That's really the fundamental question I'm trying to get into tonight as we look at that perspective. Because the fact is for many people, okay, when you're looking in terms of policy, you're trying to create the overall vision. And when you're trying to create the overall vision in a certain way, you don't want, or a person will say, if I want to be honest, I don't want to let my own subjectivity or my own leanings affected. If I'm a very liberal person, okay, and I have a certain attitude, I don't want to let my attitude affect my understanding of what God is telling me. That's an honest statement. The reality of Torah is that you can't understand Torah without bringing yourself into it. That's just the reality. Now, the way we respond to it is by people basically making a statement that says, this is what the Torah says, and negates any perception. Therefore, there's a movement towards black and white. There's a movement towards not accepting variant opinions, or even recognizing the spectrum of opinions. And the great concern is because if we open up the ability to present a spectrum of opinions, we're going to give it a perception that the individual can play games and just read into the Torah whatever they want. Let me give you an example. I'll give you a way out example, okay? Just an example that comes to mind because I think it's so way out, okay? There was an article I read back in the must be the 1980s because I was still living in New York at the time. It was an article written by someone arguing that halachic Judaism has been affected by Christian influences, and that really there is no problem with premarital relations within halachic Judaism. The only reason that we have developed this strong negative attitude towards premarital relations is because of Christian influences. So this article was trying to show from all these different sources that this is an attitude within this is how Judaism has been affected by things, by ideas and so forth. Now, the truth is, people would like to simply respond and say, hey, we're not influenced. We're pure, we maintain it pure, we have no influence whatsoever. As one person once said to me, an individual I actually respect, we were talking one day, and he comes from a Hasidic background, and I mentioned something about Hasidic garb, streimels, and coming from the 1700s. He got very, very upset and said, "What are you talking about? Moshe Rabbeinu, and what a beautiful white streimel he used to wear in the desert." Okay, there was such a movement to say there hasn't been any change. So we show we're not influenced. And on the other hand, if we show we are influenced, we have this person developing this argument that I think is totally incorrect. If you really look through the Gemara, I think it's very clear the Gemara had pretty strong attitudes towards premarital relations before we were worried about Christianity. But the point is that that's the tension you have. There's people who basically go to the extreme and saying there has been any movement. So in order to maintain this attitude that's pretty straightforward, because we don't want to have people reading into it. On the other hand, the reality of Torah, because you can go to the extreme of people reading into it beyond what's legitimate, and when you get into Reform, that's exactly what the Reform do. But now there's a big issue with homosexuals, a big issue now with Orthodox homosexuals. That there was a Shabbaton in New York City of the gay Orthodox Shabbaton, which is a real problem. I just found out this organization, I'm a rabbinic advisor of Yad HaChazakah, which deals with the Orthodox disabled. They were assisted by an organization in New York called Bikurim, which assists new organizations to get off the ground. So they when they started, they were assisted by this organization called Bikurim, and now they're at the end of their tenure, and they're soon going to be out of the Bikurim office and so forth. But I was told by the director of the organization that a new group is coming in, who might be supported by Bikurim, the Orthodox gays. Now, I mean, I've had a whole discussion on this and so forth. I mean, I do think that people who have a same-sex attraction, there's issues. They can't just be dismissed summarily. They have to be welcomed like any member of Klal Yisrael, but there's obviously limitations. And having a Shabbaton, which creates a certain type of camaraderie, and it's gone out to the scene, so they have positions in this, there's this views that they are completely contrary to halacha. They say only one act is forbidden, everything else seems to be permitted, and so forth. But the fact is that's because of the tremendous fluidity in halacha, especially now. I think that's clearly outside of halacha, but especially going to conservative reform, they play it because there's so much information that's available. So the point is, but the extreme to that is then to say black and white. This is the way it was, and this is the way it always was. Moshe Rabbeinu wore a shtreimel. Because if you say there's change, I have a problem. But on the other hand, because you're bringing the individual into the process. And that's really the dilemma of understanding that dynamic of how the individual is involved in the process, because there is a tremendous spectrum of ideas within Torah. There is different possible ways of putting together the material and coming up with policy and hashkafa and so forth. And it does involve the investigation of an individual, which involves his or her own personality and their early education, which means at some levels it's subjective, but on the other level it has to have some limits as well. So the real question is, what are the limitations upon an individual in analyzing policy analysis? Yeah.
If you believe there's a certain boundary one must stay within, and somebody believes, which I certainly don't understand, I suspect you don't, you believe that Moshe Rabbeinu wore a shtreimel.
Yeah.
But if he's within supposedly certain boundaries, is this Torah? Is this legitimate? And by the way, if it is somewhat legitimate, how many more things may seemingly be within the boundaries and are not particularly legitimate? I'll put forth maybe some notion that I wonder whether this bit about trying to accept certain things or is a bit of a cop-out, because they don't really know what some answers are. Maybe it's better so you don't throw out certain people.
Yeah.
Who otherwise sort of very similar along most lines, and it's sort of a self-preservation mechanism rather than notions of truth.
There's much truth in what you're saying, in the sense that at the core question over here, once you see that the system has a fluidity to it, then the question emerges is what's acceptable fluidity and what's unacceptable fluidity. If you're able to say that there's shivim panim l'Torah, okay, and 70 just was when we said, but the fact is there's different ways of understanding something, but that doesn't mean that that there's no incorrect way. It's always very interesting in the sense that we have this concept of Elu ve'elu, Divrei Elokim Chaim. These and those are the words of the living God. They're both acceptable, and that's used by Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Clearly, different opinions, and different opinions have major consequences. In Ish, in matters who's married, who's not married, major consequences of differences of opinion. At the same point in time, Chazal did not use that term in relation to the Sadducees. The Sadducees were clearly outside the pale, referred to them as heretics. And the fact is what made, and this is a question that emerges in thought, what made Chazal declare, or what is it about the Sadduceic analysis that put them outside the pale, while they accepted the differences of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai? How do you make that decision? And it's not as easy as some people think it is. But the truth is, you see in our world today, Reformed Jews like to accuse Elu ve'elu. It's almost any article you read from rabbis when they're dealing with things. I remember the first time I saw it was a few years ago when they were talking about same-sex marriages, and the Reformed rabbinate in Toronto was very supportive of it. Okay, they were talking about different views within the Jewish community about same-sex marriages, and one Reformed rabbi said, "Well, Elu ve'elu." Okay, so that was very, very disconcerting to me, because not every opinion that you could possibly present is acceptable. It's not an unbelievable tolerance with of Elu V'Elu. Elu V'Elu is a tolerance within a certain parameter. There's certain things outside the pale. However, trying to define it becomes much more difficult because the pale has a fluidity to it. Okay, so where do you get the point that this is okay but this isn't okay? And that really becomes a major policy issue. Because there's this other movement which happened in response, I think, to Reform Judaism, and you want to talk in terms of the Chasam Sofer concept of Chadash Asher Min Torah. That comes out of how we're going to deal in drawing the line towards the possibility that there might be heretical viewpoints that might seep in if I'm too allowance of possibilities. Therefore, there's one response was to be, hey, we need to draw the line much stricter and more concrete than it really is. Now, the question you're really raising is a policy question. It actually is a very strong policy question, in the sense that in a world that has variance, and the fact is that we don't control the fluidity, and there's movements on both sides to try and push the fluidity beyond its boundary. So how do you respond? And one response is we better concretize it and not allow fluidity. Therefore, out of that world comes statements that this is the way it always was, and we don't allow for any change. See, the underlying this becomes, really what it comes down to, is an aspect of the movement that we take in terms of change within a Torah perspective. If you bring the human being as a factor in the analysis of Torah, then what you're also doing is the human being is dynamic. Human being is in flux. The human being is in growth. At 15 he's different than at 18, at 18 he's different than at 32, 32 he's different than at 45, and therefore you're bringing an individual who is in flux himself into the process. Even in terms of the Rambam, people point out how the Rambam in his Perish Mishayis changed his mind by the time he got to his Yarech HaZakah. But Yarech HaZakah was written older, changed his mind. Another example is the famous point that they say 3 Sfarim were written by Shlomo HaMelech. Right? The 3 Sfarim are Shir HaShirim, Mishlei, and Kohelet. And they say Shir HaShirim was written in his youth, Mishlei was written in his mature years, and Kohelet was written as an older man. And the fact is they all reflect the difference of age in that regard. In youth, you're much more romantic and much more hopeful, and so forth and so forth. In Mishlei, in mature, you're much more mature, and so forth and so forth. And then in Kohelet, it's a very somewhat pessimistic view, because you're already older in age. You become a little bit more pessimistic, maybe. Now, the fact is, you have to read that with a certain amount of care. Does it mean that Shlomo changed his mind? No. But the fact is that as a human being, you are dynamic in nature. And if you take humanity over history, humanity in history has gone through tremendous changes. And therefore, if you take in the human being who's dynamic and says this dynamic figure plays a role in the understanding of Torah, then you have this issue, well, that can make Torah overly dynamic or overly changing. Yet Torah is concrete. Torah is from Maimon Har Sinai and doesn't change. Fundamental principle of Torah is it does not change. So the fact is, but on the other hand, what you're doing is you're saying, but the only way to understand Torah is by taking this dynamic figure, the human being, and put that person in together with the concrete. And what comes out of that analysis? So if there is great fear of over-dynamism, of pushing beyond the limits, then you concretize it, which ends up saying Moshe Rabbeinu wore a white shtreimel. On the other hand, if you basically say Torah is totally open to analysis and human perception, and you see over time it's changed, well, that leads in the simplest way to the historical school, which is conservative Judaism, that basically saw history as having a major factor in Torah, and it changed because of history, versus, and even more so when you go into the Reform movement. And the dilemma is balancing it out. And then the dilemma is finding out what are the acceptable policy alternatives within Torah Judaism. And that's really it. And that's what it comes down to when we deal with the human being's involvement, because the human being is going through change. And the way this comes down to, in a certain way, is how you deal with new ideas, new drives, new values in humanity. We have movements in our world today. Let's say women's liberation movement. How is women's liberation movement? How would the women's liberation movement going to affect Torah? So you might get a set answer. The first approach of a person will be a set answer. But usually you'll have, this is the attitude of Torah. But the fact is that if you step back, you see there's a variety of answers, and what you really encounter is a greater question of how do you deal with this change of the women's liberation movement meeting Torah, which is somewhat concrete and unchanging.
Well, obviously, if it does change, it is changing.
Well, the fact is what is legitimate change? What does it mean? Because the truth is that this is exactly the point. The way Torah would be unchanging perfectly unchanging, if it was written like a Shulchan Aruch at the point of Sinai. If God would have written it black and white. But by God opening up the necessity of human involvement in that analysis and the human mind in that analysis, then by definitions He's allowing for the changing nature of the human being to become a factor in Torah. And then the question comes, well, when is it that the changing nature is actually defying Torah? Because the point is what it comes down to is that there's a tension here between the concrete position of Torah or a certain type of let's say changing, but let's say Minhag Yisrael, the fact of the custom of Klal Yisrael, which creates a certain conservatism within the Jewish world, certain idea of minhag, certain idea of Masorah. What happens when that meets the changing nature of the world? And that's really one of the biggest policy issues in the world today. The world has gone through dramatic changes in their thinking in the last 60 years. From the sexual revolution of the 60s to women's liberation, now you have the gay rights and so forth and so forth. A remarkable change in the nature of humanity. You think about this. Think in terms of women's movements. Okay? You could say that some aspects of the change of women happens with the First World War, happened with the Second World War. But the fact that from the early 1900s when women got the vote to the fact that you had this tremendous development of women's rights, right? That was a complete different nature of women from 1200. Now this is off the top of my head. 1200 to 1600. How much difference was there in terms of women? Yeah, there were a few exceptions. Elizabeth was queen, whatever, something like that. Some powerful women. But generally, women were all seen the same way. All of a sudden, the last 100 years, it's a total change. A total change in the way we look at them. So the point is how does that play a role in terms of how we look at women? So the fact is, people come back and say, well, we have a Masorah. We have a Masorah. This is the way it always was. This is the way it always was. But the Torah itself has opened itself up to the analysis of human beings, because the Torah itself, it demands the human analysis to bring it out. And human beings now looking at the Torah has been affected by our world around us. And we're going through a tremendous amount of issues where we're talking about women's issues within halacha, but the real underlying issue is that we are going through a change in our thinking, and the Torah incorporates us in our analysis of women, or incorporates us in our analysis of Torah. So therefore, the Torah itself says, you, dynamically changing human being, are a figure in trying to understand me. And even though I have a concrete origin in Har Sinai. And that balance is a tremendously difficult balance. Yeah.
It would seem to me that to the extent one allows for significant change, regardless of whatever movement it is, but just in the way that things are being viewed, perhaps it also says in some way that, let's say, the rabbi's position on women in the 1700s was not correct. I mean, they missed something, and you sort of wonder how far you can sort of...
But you see, but that's exactly the problem.
I know, I agree that's a problem. And again, it gets back to notions, for me, for notions of how do I know what I know, what is truth?
Right.
And if there are too many mistakes, seeming mistakes, then my allegiance to pronouncements going back further in time, it becomes much more problematical.
Right, and therefore, and that's a problem, and that is in the sense that there's such a concept of Masorah and our allegiance to past conclusions, the Shulchan Aruch, the conclusions of the Shulchan Aruch, that raises a lot of this issue. But what I'm trying to say, this is a fundamental policy issue. Let me give you an example. Okay, out of this. Take the and by the way, this idea, the question is where this idea of movement exists. So I'm going to give you some examples of movements. First of all, even I think I mentioned this before. The concept of Mashiach represents some kind of movement forward, especially in the concept of the Rambam that says basically Mashiach is supposed to be when we finally accomplish certain ideals, okay, in terms of the certain developments, okay, and that also fits into the concept of Tikkun Olam, that somehow the world will get the understanding of the, okay, of what do you call it, of Yom Hazeh Hashem Echad U'Shmo Echad, that there'll be a perception that we'll finally get it right. There's concepts within Torah that seem to imply there's movements forward that get it right. But let me give you an example, like the Rambam in terms of Mashiach and so forth. You improve the world. You have this concept in Kabbalistic concepts of Tikkun Olam in the classic Kabbalistic sense, or in the or another sense, not the way that term has been misused by Reform Judaism. To apply to humanitarianism, that's not really what Tikkun Olam is about. Hasidus even talks about this in the sense that Hasidim says, why is it Nister was kept hidden for so many years? Because only a certain point in time was it able to have Nister to come out. You find this in Kabbalistic terms, for example, in terms of the moon and the sun. That in the beginning the moon had to retreat, but then at the end of the days the moon and the sun will come out. And then they even apply that to women in Judaism, because the woman is compared to the moon and the man is compared to the sun, and the woman and the women retracted, withdrew to let the man dominate, the same way the moon withdrew. But in some Kabbalistic ideas, but at the end of the days, women will then accept their position of equality. You know, like the moon will then shine that sun, like the sun. Okay. Anyways, and it's a very interesting idea because that's Kabbalistic. Yet, you know, I'm sure people would look at this and say that they don't see too much movements in the women's rights in the more Kabbalistic areas of the Jewish world. Okay, that's a side comment. I'm sorry, but anyways, but the fact is that. But let me give you an idea in terms of movement. Let's take the concept of slavery. Torah clearly permits slavery, right? Okay. How many people here own slaves?
You have to treat, if you go to the halakha, you have to treat your slaves so well,
right,
that it's almost not worth it.
Right, exactly, right. That evidently, but particularly. But
how many of us are slaves?
The question is how many people think slavery? I mean, the idea of owning another person. How many people think about slavery? When you look at slaves, look at the stories in the South, and you see a story of how a man, a child, a 12-year-old kid is being sold and will never see his parents again and is crying. And so we have this very negative attitude towards slavery, right? Okay. The fact is the Torah permits it. So people challenge the Torah, you see it permits it and so forth and so forth. The point is that they have the argument, well, the Torah permitted it, but it created an attitude that would make it very difficult, eventually leading people to drop it. Okay? That concept is presented by Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz. He has a term for that. That's what he called Torah tolerated. He says there's certain things in the Torah, and the Rambam says it specifically by Karbanot. He says really there shouldn't have been Karbanot, but of course Baruch Hu gave in to the drive of Karbanot. Eventually there won't be Karbanot. So he actually looked upon the fact, even though in the Yad Chazaka he goes back and says, it says clearly in the Zman Mashiach there will be Karbanot, and he means real sacrifices, animal sacrifices, but in the Mara he talks about how prayer is much more in line with the ideal. But the point is you have this movement forward that's built in the halachic system, that somehow halacha is supposed to affect us, and in turn affect our behavior, right? And we have this concept with asmachta, according to some Rishonim, that asmachta is a hint in the Torah of what a law should be. And there's some Rishonim who learned what it means is the Torah is basically saying that this is what should be, and eventually you guys will be able to create this law. In other words, this is really an ideal, we're going to get there. But the point is that once you have this Torah mandated idea, you then have this perception that there's going to be change and actually new perceptions. So I'll give you an example, monogamy. Okay? Is monogamy a greater ideal or is it less of an ideal? This gets into this issue. If you say monogamy is a greater ideal, it means, what are you saying, 2,000 years ago? Well, the truth is they say that there was no... someone said that among all the Chazal, there's only one case, I don't even know this, but there's only one case of a member of Chazal that was married to two wives at the same time. They did remarry, but but you don't have cases of polygamy among Chazal. That's what someone I read someone say that, or I heard someone say that. But the fact is that how do you look at monogamy now? Well, the Torah clearly allows polygamy, and there were clearly great people in the Torah who did have more than wives. David and Melech. Melech might be a little bit different, but the fact is now we have monogamy. Is it good? Is it not good? Well, if it's good, it's your question. Doesn't mean the people back then were wrong, or it means we were affected. So it means that we're doing something different than what they were doing back then. What does it mean to be affected? And now we're saying this is an ideal. And the fact is it gets into this tension. Are we moving forward? Are we not moving forward? How does a human being bring himself into this? Now the truth is, I specifically mentioned Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz, he makes some statements in terms of women's rights to this extent. And this is where it gets a little bit of hot water in terms of people. In terms of slavery, it's a pretty straightforward concept. Karbanot, the Rambam himself says this concept, although the Ramban gets very angry at the Rambam for making this statement about Karbanot. Exactly for that reason. What are you saying? The Torah at Har Sinai gives Karbanot, and you're saying it wasn't the ideal? That's black and white. So that was that policy issue. But at the same point in time, Rabbi Berkowitz presents this idea with women in Judaism. And he starts saying there's going to be, and he's very, very liberal in terms of perspectives in women's in Judaism. He says there's going to be changes that well, never happened before, but that's because we now see things new. Well, what do you mean? They were wrong before? Saying the Dolim of the past were wrong? That was your question. So it becomes an issue. And that issue is a major policy issue. But the thing that we have to look at is what makes, or what I try to do is I'm saying, listen, for sure that tension exists. To negate your dynamic nature, to try to solve this problem by saying any dynamic changes is wrong, that's just not real. The fact is we are dynamic beings in flux. Humanity is in flux. And the Torah itself calls upon humanity to be involved in the process of understanding it. So one of the questions is, what do you do with the past? How do you understand this moving forward? That's a philosophical question. How do you understand the movement forward and the change, and how do you look back and say people before us were greater than us, and yet we're moving ahead, and so forth? That's a philosophical question. But in terms of a policy question, the question that exists in terms of policy is, what is the role of this dynamism in this system? What's acceptable dynamism? What's not acceptable dynamism? How is this how is this movement for movement to play a role correctly? And that involves an analysis of your own motivation and the way you bring yourself into that movement of Torah. So I know for myself, there's certain views that I have, let's say, in terms of women in Judaism, that I take a certain approach to women in Judaism, for example, that I think that in a certain way I have certain parameters of how I will apply what I perceive to be the new perceptions into the realm of Torah. Because it's not enough to say, hey, I got a new idea. I have to figure out what is the acceptable way of bringing new ideas into Torah. That to me is the major issue. Yeah.
I think that's a very key point.
Yeah.
You need a methodology
right.
to deal with the dynamic.
Right. That's where we're going to next week. In the sense that what I want to do next week is I want to give you some ideas of my own methodology. But the fact is that that's the issue. And it's that methodology. There's no doubt that there's a role of the dynamic nature of the human being and changes in society into Torah, because Torah calls upon the human being to analyze it. I can only explain how I do my own self-analysis to try and figure out what is the correct place to bring that role into the process. Okay, and that's my questions, and that's really where I draw the line. And this is a major issue that exists in terms of women in Judaism. Where do I draw the line that says there's a Masorah? Like one of the issues that exist nowadays is and it's a big issue. Like for example, women leading. We'll take an issue that clearly is said. You can't say this is usher. Women leading. The Kabbalat Shabbos program. That's a new issue that has emerged about can a woman leader of Kabbalat Shabbat, okay, without getting into the issue of Kol Isha. Okay, first of all, you say she's not going to sing; she'll just read it, she'll just say it. Or even if she does sing, you can say it's Kol. You can say there's Heterim for Shiri Shabbat Vahodah by Kol Isha, so forth, so forth, so forth. Songs of praise of God. You can say that's an allowance for Kol Isha. Women sing Kol Isha. Many people sing Zmirot. Women sing Zmirot and so forth. So the fact is, that's an issue. But the truth is that you have an issue where this issue comes up. And it's becoming an adamantly issue within the Orthodox. You have this movement that's saying we want to have women leading Kabbalat Shabbat, and there's a few radical shuls that do this. And you can't say it's absolutely awesome. You can't open and say it's halachically wrong, because it's clearly not. What?
My father or my grandfather.
That's exactly it. So the answer is it's that it's not the Masorah. We don't have the Masorah. It's connected the minhag. It's connected the Masorah. The minhag of not seeing something is a problem. Is a minhag. If you say it's a minhag because a minhag, there's a whole issue. If something which has never been done, like I've never seen this done before, does that have a status of a minhag? It's a big issue. It's a Tosfos in first Tosfos in Chulin deals with this. Women shechted. Some people say because women never shechted, it's a minhag Yisrael for women not to shecht. And a lot of people say, what are you, I think so, it says himself, so what are you talking about? A minhag can't be established because you never saw it. It has to be something that's been doing. The fact that someone never do it doesn't establish a minhag. So the fact that women never did it, that because it's clearly a Masorah, women didn't do it, so on and so forth. The fact is that, but wait a second. Does that mean everything? And that's a perfect example of a tension that exists in women's rights in our world today. Because the policy people are saying, listen, there's a dynamic nature that's inherent in Torah. And the person is involved in Torah. And the other people are saying, wait a second, there's also concrete, right, like sort of conservative aspect to Torah. And there's an idea of Masorah, and there's an idea of Minhag Yisrael, and there's an idea of you can't just change things. And the question is, so wait a second, you got these two forces happening. So in terms of the community, you got people, radicals on the right-hand side, saying, we're going to do it. Because you can't prove it to me it's halachically wrong. Okay? And the other people are basically saying, in the extreme other side, right, Moshe Rabbeinu wore a strimal, right? Because there's never been any change. There's the issue in the saints of saying, well, there's obviously been something happening, so how do you understand it? And therefore, what happens is it just de facto? just whatever happens out there, or you have to figure out what the methodology you have to apply in that analysis. And that's the real key policy question. How do you apply methodology of balancing these two factors? Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah.
My reaction to the notion that the Almighty was kind of pandering to the B'nai Israel, whether it's korbanos or something else which they didn't do. I mean, if the Almighty can say you're going to have Shabbos, which is quite a change from where it was, it just seems to me that argument is rather weak.
Okay. There are many, that's the Rambam's argument, and there's other people get very upset with the Rambam's argument for a variety of reasons. The fact is that it seems to be that a lot of what Akadosh Baruch Hu wanted to do is get away from any association with idolatry, and there's a lot of issues with the Rambam's argument, but that is a classic Rambam's argument, which a lot of people point to. You have a question?
The Reform and conservative streams believe in or follow the Gemara?
Yes, for sure. In terms of conservative Judaism, the conservative. You see, conservative Judaism has gone through major shifts. The origination of the conservative movement was in the historical school of Germany, Breslau, or whatever. But the fact is that you'd be very hard pressed to see a distinction between them and and let's say some aspects of Orthodox, especially modern Orthodoxy. The fact is, it's very, very. It's not the original conservative. It's very, very difficult to really draw the line. And there's a lot of argument to say that the reason that they were so concerned about the movement was because of the Reform, and therefore they were less open to more allowance for dynamism. But the fact is, the historical school basically said that people were affected by their societies and making halachic analysis and so forth and so forth. So, like for example, this halacha developed because Jews were influenced by Christian concepts, and over there the other halacha because they were developed by Muslims. They much more explained it by the flow of the society to an extent that would be too much with Orthodoxy. In many ways, Orthodoxy doesn't want to limit it to analysis. We don't want to say that someone had this idea because he was brought up in 16th century Catholic Poland, right? The fact is that may have been an influence, but usually we want to end up but his final conclusions have to stand the test of time. So there's some issues on that, but clearly the conservative do see that in the Gemara. They see the whole movement of the Gemara to be moved forward. In terms of the Reform movement, they're even more than that. So the Reform movement considers themselves now to be the modern day Pharisees, because the Sadducees, from their perspective, were the small c conservative types who maintained the tradition, and at that point in time, the tradition was the literal reading of the Tanakh. The Pharisees were the radicals who wanted to re-understand it. So their understanding is that they are the modern Pharisees, because the Orthodox read things too literally, and they are the modern Pharisees who can take new ideas in Torah and develop it the same way as the Pharisees did. Of course, behind all that is the question of whether you accept Maimon Har Sinai. The reason that the way they read the Gemara is as this whole world of fluidity, and therefore to allow even greater fluidity, they want to drop any aspect of any divinity, any divine statement of Maimon Har Sinai. That's why the modern conservative, maybe 50 years ago, there were people in the conservative movement who believed in Maimon Har Sinai. Now you'd be very hard pressed to find anyone in the conservative movement who really believes in Maimon Har Sinai. It's more like there was a divine influence and an inspiration or whatever. And for sure in the Reform movement, but the way they read the whole of and it's hard to talk about this because it's almost like it's as I say it, I'm cringing as I say it. Lahavdal Devdos, they see it as the human involvement of the divine inspiration, sort of that they believe there already been some original divine inspiration of ideas, and therefore man used his mind as he developed, and what the Gemara is to them is the expression of all this fluidity. So to them, the Gemara is very important. I remember once seeing in some lists in Reform movement what's most important, and they put the Gemara ahead of Tanakh as being important. So yeah, there's fluidity, and the question of how we deal with the fluidity is very, very serious. That's really our issue, and that's fundamental to the policy issue. Okay. That's why I remember once seeing someone trying to compare the conservatives to the Karaites. They are far away from the Karaites. Reform movement is far away from the Karaites. They love the Gemara because it allows them to read anything they want. So you have to understand the way they see it is from our perspective. We believe that, of course, Baruch Hu actually said when it says Ayin Tachas Ayin, it was meant money right from the beginning. Right? From their perspective, they say, no, originally was these people had this idea that it was an eye for an eye, and then the Pharisees came about and said this is barbaric, and we come up with this new idea. That's how they can now say, yes, it says in the Bible this and this and this, but we can now read it, and we're being the modern Pharisees. And of course, Chazal are turning over in their graves when they hear such ideas.